Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Hey friends, tonight we're stepping away from the lofty halls of philosophy and plunging into something far more visceral: medieval junk food. Greasy, indulgent, and surprisingly relatable. Because even in a world without golden arches, vending machines, or street vendors yelling about hot dogs, people still crave the comfort of a quick, satisfying bite. And let me tell you, what they came up with? Some of it was unexpectedly delightful. Some of it was mildly horrifying, but all of it was beautifully, unapologetically medieval. Before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying these strange little journeys into the past, give this video a like and consider subscribing, only if it feels true to you. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a quiet wonder to see these moments shared across time zones and continents. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan. That low hum always feels like company. Let yourself sink into the atmosphere. This isn't just history, it's a mood. A memory that never belonged to us, but somehow still feels familiar. Let's talk apple fritters, the unlikely heroes of medieval snacking. In a world where most food was either bland or vaguely threatening, these golden little rounds were a revelation. Sweet, hot, comforting, slightly dangerous, like most good medieval decisions. They weren't made with glossy supermarket apples, of course. Think smaller, sourer, a bit misshapen, the kind that grew in the shadow of an alehouse or on the edge of someone else's land, the kind you picked with a grin and a glance over your shoulder. They were chopped, folded into a crude batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because clean water was a gamble, and ale made everything taste a little less like regret. And then came the moment of alchemy. Deep frying in the 1300s was not for the faint of heart. The oil, most often pig fat, had been used and reused, darkened with age and stories. It gave flavor, a word we're using generously here. But what came out of the pan was something worth risking your fingers for. Blistering hot, golden brown, crackling with possibility. A fresh fritter wasn't just food, it was a stolen moment of pleasure. A crisp edge, a tender middle, and a whisper of burn if you weren't patient. But who had patience in a world like that? It was joy. Brief, imperfect, and entirely human. If you were lucky, and let's be honest, wealthy, your fritter might arrive with a delicate dusting of imported sugar. Not just a treat, but a quiet boast, a shimmering signal that you could afford sweetness brought from far-off shores. For everyone else, a modest drizzle of honey or a ladle of spiced syrup had to suffice, but it didn't really matter. Either way, it was sweet enough to momentarily transport you, to pull you out of the gray blur of salted meats and root vegetables, where cabbage endlessly played dress-up as other foods. Fritters weren't just food, they were moments. Picked up from a street cart after church or grabbed during the loud chaos of market day. A reward, a small rebellion, a pause in the monotony. You didn't care about grease on your tunic. It was worth it. Children devoured them with sticky fingers and wide eyes. Adults smiled behind bites, nostalgia and satisfaction mingling in each chew. Even birds, sharp-eyed and shameless, would swoop in for their share. Because fritters were joy. Quick, hot, fleeting joy. The kind that reminded you that life, despite the drafty stone walls and muddy streets, still had room for pleasure. Sure, they could be overcooked, the apples might veer too tart, or the batter might cling like damp wool. But when they were good, and oh, when they were good, one bite was enough to make you forgive everything. For that brief, golden moment, you understood why people endured the grime and grit of medieval life, why they kept going. And if fritters were the medieval donut, then cheese curds were something humbler, quieter, maybe even a little awkward. The popcorn of the past, bite-sized, a bit squeaky, and unapologetically unpredictable. They weren't showy. They didn't melt into ribbons or stretch across a warm plate. They didn't try to be anything they weren't. That was their charm. Let's not romanticize it. Medieval cheese had no aspirations of elegance. It was born out of necessity, consumed without ceremony, and expected to endure the harsh demands of travel, neglect, and livestock with poor spatial awareness. Cheese curds were newborn cheese, tender, unripened, still soft from the process. They emerged from the alchemy of curdling milk with rennet, a method that sounds refined until you learn it involves enzymes from a baby animal's stomach. But in a world without waste, it worked. And from that practicality came these humble, irregular lumps of comfort. They didn't need to impress. They just needed to fill, to nourish, to hold a bit of warmth in your hand. Something small and satisfying in a world that often gave you neither. The curds were pressed gently, salted with care, and then that was it. No fanfare, no elaborate aging, just a simple ending to a humble beginning. Cheese curds, sometimes tender, sometimes rubbery, sometimes squeaking between your teeth like they had something to say. There was something oddly intimate about that sound, like the curds were reminding you they were alive once. And in a world where snack often meant stale bread or lukewarm broth, these little curds felt like an unexpected kindness. Monks treasured them in their quiet cloisters. Travelers tucked them into their packs like edible prayer beads. And children? They devoured them with sticky fingers and sheepish grins, so long as the cows had been kind that week. You could fry them till golden and crisp, scatter them over a steaming bowl of stew, or eat them straight from the basket, pretending not to smell faintly of hay and livestock. They didn't need ceremony. They weren't reserved for feasts or saints' days. They were just there. Always. Steady. Like the friend who never dazzles but always shows up. The one who doesn't need to be extraordinary to matter. The one who stays when everything else is crumbling. Sure, sometimes they tasted a little off, a little too sharp, a little too barnyard, but in the Middle Ages, freshness was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. And when life is unpredictable, you learn to find joy in what's available. With enough salt and optimism, most people didn't mind. No, cheese curds weren't glamorous, but they were dependable. They were nourishing. They were just indulgent enough to feel like a stolen pleasure on a hard day. And honestly, they were unmatched when it came to bribing cats or small children. And then there were turnips. Let's just begin with the obvious. Turnips are not dessert. But in a world where sugar was a luxury, apples came and went with the seasons, and culinary creativity often came from desperation rather than inspiration. Someone, somewhere, looked at a turnip and thought, this could be something more. What if this were pie? A question born of boredom, necessity, and a dash of reckless hope. And thus, the turnip pie emerged. Now let's be honest, it wasn't always terrible. On some days, it was even strangely satisfying. Imagine mashed turnips, soft if you were lucky, folded gently with a bit of egg, maybe sweetened with honey or dotted with dried fruit if the cook was feeling particularly kind. All of it tucked into a humble crust made not of luxury, but of flour, water, and sheer determination. The result? Edible, occasionally comforting. At its best, it was warm, faintly sweet, and oddly nostalgic, like a peasant's version of pudding, clinging to the memory of something better. At its worst, it tasted like someone had baked disappointment into a crust and called it tradition, but it endured. Turnip pies survived not because they were exquisite, but because they were enough. Turnips were cheap. Pie crusts were forgiving. Together, they created a kind of alchemy, one that turned questionable ingredients into something resembling dessert. It wasn't cheesecake. It barely counted as pie. But it tried. And in medieval kitchens where trying was a radical act of resilience, that mattered. You'd see them at fairs, on the outskirts of feast tables, and in abbey kitchens, where monks had too many root vegetables and not enough distractions. Some added nutmeg, if the abbey had coin. Others, pepper, if the cook had chaos in their soul. And raisins, they showed up like awkward guests, never quite fitting in. Nobles didn't touch turnip pie unless they were slumming it for amusement or feigning humility for political gain. But for the rest, the villagers, the workers, the hungry, it was a kind of celebration. Not of extravagance, but of effort. A small, strange sweetness at the end of a long day. It was dessert. Sort of. More like an edible sigh wrapped in pastry. And yet, it stayed. It outlived the jokes, the judgment, the centuries. Because people liked it, or at least they didn't dislike it enough to let it go. And sometimes that's all a recipe needs. To be remembered. To be enough. To be a little warm, a little sweet, and exactly what someone needed, even if they didn't know they needed it. If the medieval world had a comfort food champion, something that offered a moment of warmth in a cold and uncertain life, it was the meat pasty. A humble handheld pie filled with seasoned meat and cradled in a thick folded crust, then baked until golden or charred. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't refined, but it meant something. It was sustenance, it was survival, and on a good day, it was even a small pleasure. In many ways, it was the medieval hot pocket. If the hot pocket had to survive open flames, questionable meat, and a world where snack time might be interrupted by a hanging or a hailstorm. What made the pasty special wasn't just the food, it was the feeling. The comfort of something warm in your hands. The promise of fullness. The way it stayed hot under its thick pastry shell, guarding the precious contents from mud, rats, or the stray sneeze of a fellow peasant. But let's talk about that filling. Meat was a generous word. If you were lucky, if you lived near nobility or the edge of a hunting estate, you might find tender pork, mutton, or venison inside. Real meat. Meat with a name and a story. If not, the pasty became a quiet confession of desperation and creativity. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Anything that once moved could be chopped, spiced, and buried in pastry. A savory little secret. Spices like sage, garlic, or pepper were added, not just for flavor, but for mercy. To mask the scent of time, to distract from the fact that the meat might have crossed the line from aged to risky. But in an age without refrigeration, where lunch was usually dry bread or raw onions, even that questionable filling tasted like a feast. There were even vegetarian pasties with leeks, root vegetables, or cheese for fasting days or those living a life of piety. But let's be honest, the meat pasties were the real prize. Greasy, steaming, satisfyingly heavy in the hand. You didn't ask what was inside, you didn't want to know. You just bit in and hoped the cook wasn't having a bad day. And in the mines and fields, there was something quietly beautiful about the way people claimed their pasties. Initials pressed into the crust or symbols scratched in like edible signatures. Sometimes one edge of the pastry was made extra thick. Not to eat, but to hold with soiled hands and then throw away. A gesture both practical and oddly reverent, tossed to the rats or to the spirits watching in the dust. Because in a world where comfort was rare and certainty even rarer, the pasty wasn't just food. It was a moment of warmth. A pocket of hope tucked into pastry. So were they good? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the enchantment, part of what made eating a meat pasty feel like a gamble worth taking. You didn't bite into one because you wanted safety. You did it because in a world ruled by uncertainty, flavor was one of the few risks that felt worth the fallout. And then there were the candied fennel seeds. Tiny, glittering fragments of hope in a time when brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and whispering a prayer. These little seeds were more than just a sweet bite. They were ritual, relief. Wrapped in hardened sugar, carrying the whisper of licorice and the bite of something old and herbal, they walked the line between treat and trial. They crunched like glass between your teeth, if you dared to chew at all. You didn't just pop one absent-mindedly. You tested the shell first, pressed it with your tongue, bit down slowly, reverently, listening with your bones for that first decisive crack, because one wrong move and your molar might never forgive you. But still, you ate them. Because someone somewhere had believed enough in the idea of sweetness to import sugar across oceans, to boil it over fire, to coat these seeds one by one with patience and faith. They didn't just want flavor, they wanted beauty, delicacy, control over the chaos that defined their days. The nobility served them in polished dishes after feasts, as if to say, here, forget the mutton lodged in your teeth. Here's something prettier to remember instead. And common folk, if they were lucky, got a humbler version. Honey, herbs, and hope molded into something vaguely sweet. Flavor-wise, they were polarizing. Either you loved that licorice hit, or you smiled through the bitterness and politely moved on. But even then, they lingered on your tongue, in your breath, in your memory, a sensory echo of indulgence in a world that rarely offered such luxuries. And maybe that's why they mattered. Because in a time of mud-soaked hems and too much mead, of fireside shadows and uncertain mornings, these seeds were more than just food. They were an attempt at elegance, a flicker of grace in the grime, a reminder that even when life was hard and sharp and strange, it could also sometimes be sweet. If medieval desserts had a golden child, it was undoubtedly the honey cake, sweet, dense, and determined to cling to everything except your expectations. Honey cakes weren't just food, they were a quiet kind of defiance, a small rebellion against the harshness of everyday life. Born from the ambition of bakers who dared to dream in an age where sugar was a royal treasure, locked behind gates most would never see. Honey, by contrast, was the people's sweetness. If you had bees knew someone who did, or were brave or foolish enough to scale a tree and earn your reward sting by sting, the ingredients were humble: flour, water, and generous dollops of honey, or whatever generous meant when spoons were less about measuring and more about fending off your siblings. But somehow these simple elements came together to create something unexpectedly enduring. The result? A firm, chewy slab of golden comfort. Some days, it felt like a tender treat. Other days, it was a brick disguised as dessert, solid enough to double as a weapon or a doorstop. And yet, it was loved. Spices were the crown jewels, added when a household felt flush with fortune or simply wanted to make a statement. A pinch of nutmeg, a whisper of cloves, a dusting of cinnamon. These weren't just flavors. They were invitations for gossip, admiration, and maybe even a little envy. Your honey cake could make you memorable. It could turn a recipe into a legend. If dried fruits found their way in, it meant you'd either outrun the local children or hidden your stash before it became wine. Honey cakes showed up at life's turning points, at feasts and festivals, at weddings and wakes. Not just because they lasted, but because they meant something. They were the kind of food you made when you cared enough to plan ahead, when you wanted something solid in a world that rarely gave you guarantees. They were also communication, sweet, stubborn, and layered with meaning, a gift, a gesture, a soft jab. Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your personality. They weren't delicate, no. Cutting one felt like a quiet battle between your knife and your pride, but in a time when nothing came easy, that texture was a reminder. The best things didn't have to be soft, they just had to last. Eating them wasn't graceful, and they weren't meant to be. These cakes weren't soft pillows of sweetness. They were forged for a world of stone walls and splintered carts, dense enough to survive a long winter and sticky enough to glue your fingers together with the memory of honey. You didn't nibble them, you committed to them. But beneath their toughness was something oddly tender. They tasted like warmth, like celebration whispered into an ordinary day. A flicker of indulgence in a world that rarely allowed it, where meals were more punishment than pleasure, and sweetness was a fleeting rumor. In those few chewy bites, there was comfort. There was joy, rough-edged, sugar-dusted joy, the kind that reminded you what it meant to be human, in a life where survival often stole softness. They were more than food. They were a moment of reprieve from salted grains and scavenged leftovers, a quiet rebellion against the bleakness. And then there were the fried fish skin cracklings, unexpected, undignified, utterly unforgettable. Born not from luxury, but from desperation and ingenuity, the kind that only emerges when waste is not an option, and a pile of slippery fish skins stares back at you like it's daring you to try something foolish. Someone tried, and something beautiful happened. Dropped into hot oil, the skins surrendered, shriveling into brittle, golden strips that crackled like dry leaves and tasted like the sea had been condensed into a bite. Not elegant, but honest, crisp, salty, unapologetic. A sprinkle of salt turned them from survival into satisfaction, a touch of garlic or herbs. That was art, that was ambition. That was someone saying, maybe this life can offer more. They weren't glamorous, they didn't pretend to be, but they fed bodies, and maybe in their strange little way, they fed spirits too. Portable, durable, rich in fat and flavor, exactly what a weary soul needed after a day spent wrestling sheep, gathering firewood, or simply making it to the end of another hard-earned breath. Soldiers packed them out of necessity. Sailors clung to them like lifelines on endless salt-bitten journeys. And peasants, gods bless them, hawked them outside taverns for a handful of coins and the strange satisfaction of silencing rowdy drunks with something louder than their voices. Did they still have scales clinging stubbornly to the batter? Sometimes. Did they twist into unsettling shapes that made you question not just your appetite, but your entire existence? Absolutely. But by medieval standards, they were almost elegant, crisp on the outside, full of flavor, and, miracle of miracles, unlikely to leave you doubled over with dysentery by dawn. The only real drawback? The smell. These things could announce themselves like a battle horn, carrying through stone walls and thatched roofs alike. If you dared to fry a batch indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's forgotten socks for at least a week. And yet, you'd be forgiven. Because they were worth it. They were good. Really, truly good in a world where edible was often the highest praise food could earn. And when life dealt you stale bread and warm sour beer, you didn't complain. You created. You leaned into the alchemy of survival and made something that somehow still felt like comfort, bread soaked in ale. They called it soups or trench toast, though the name mattered less than what it offered. Warmth, weight, and a fleeting sense of being taken care of. It was like French toast stripped of its joy. No eggs, no sugar, no cinnamon. Just the bones of something familiar clinging to warmth. You took yesterday's bread, the kind that could dent a helmet, and plunged into ale, not some fragrant golden craft brew. No, this was flat, lukewarm ale, barely alcoholic, born in a smoky corner of someone's kitchen with hygiene standards measured in shrugs. The bread drank it in like it had been waiting all night. It softened just enough to stop threatening your molars. And in that quiet transformation, stale turned to supple, bitterness turned to body, something soothing emerged. Was it delicious? Not really, but it was edible, dependable, and in the right light, a flickering candle, a tired sigh, a moment of silence between tasks, it almost tasted like care. Like a hand on your shoulder saying, "You're doing fine. Sit, eat." It wasn't just food, it was a pause in a hard life, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes, if fortune smiled, people added little luxuries, a scatter of herbs, a crumble of cheese, or on rare mornings, a fried egg offered up by a cooperative hen. On feast days, the humble fare was elevated. Sops soaked in spiced ale appeared on tables, signaling that someone had unearthed a sliver of nutmeg and for a brief moment believed in magic again. Like so many things from the medieval kitchen, this dish served more than hunger. It was invention born from necessity, a quiet ritual of not wasting what little one had. Bread too hard to chew? Soak it. Ale beginning to sour? Pour it on bread and call it tradition. Resourcefulness wasn't a choice. It was survival with a creative twist. There was, however, one flaw. It didn't travel well. Once drenched, the bread transformed into a sort of mushy porridge brick. Eat it quick or resign yourself to a soggy lump that tasted like a metaphor for good intentions gone soft. And yet, on a cold night beside a fading fire, a bowl of ale-soaked bread could feel like warmth itself. Simple, tender, quietly enough. If you've ever stared at a slice of bread and thought this would be better submerged in alcohol, then congratulations, you share a culinary quirk with the medieval upper class. Sops and wine weren't just food, they were a mood, a dessert, yes, technically. But more than that, they were an experience, half indulgence, half improvisation. The ritual was strangely elegant. Toast the bread, or find a piece not entirely stale, then immerse it in warm spiced wine, the kind that smelled of cloves and centuries. Not just any wine, but something sweetened, mulled, perhaps just slightly past its prime, the kind that made you forget the draft in the stone walls. The result, a soft, fragrant delicacy eaten with a spoon, ideally very slowly, while pretending to enjoy the lute music playing from a corner. Nobles called it refined. Others suspected it was just what happened when the pantry ran out of better ideas. It made its appearance at banquets, midnight suppers, and those dinners where conversations stalled and everyone quietly reached for another bite of soggy toast, grateful perhaps for something to do with their hands. When made with care, sops in wine could be oddly moving. They were warm, gently boozy, comforting in the way old lullabies are. The wine brought depth. The bread gave substance, and the spices offered the illusion of opulence. And for a few fleeting minutes, wrapped in flickering candlelight and cinnamon steam, you felt like you belonged to something. Not just a table, but a moment, shared across time. When done poorly, it was just wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could mask the uncomfortable truth. You were chewing on a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were tossed in for flair. Sometimes cheese joined the mix. Occasionally, a whole egg made its way in. At that point, it wasn't just a snack anymore. It became a mysterious culinary gamble. Peasants crafted their own versions, often swapping wine for cheap vinegar or ale. This wasn't dessert. It was dinner or breakfast or whatever you dared to call a meal that left you both full and bewildered. Still, sops and wine held their place, warm, filling, and offering a fleeting taste of indulgence, even if the flavor resembled sponge soaked in mold and regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a treasure, sugary, exotic, and tough enough to endure a crusade. But don't be fooled. This wasn't your modern trail mix with cheerful, resealable bags. Medieval dried fruit had a singular mission: to last. Taste? Optional. Texture? Brutally chewy. Dental damage? Almost guaranteed. Let's break it down. The usual suspects: raisins, figs, dates, and for the truly privileged, imported prunes. These fruits had been sun-dried, smoke-dried, or in some cases simply abandoned on a windowsill until all moisture had fled. Wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense, like edible time capsules from the last harvest. The upside? They were sweet. Intensely sweet. Concentrated sugars turned these shriveled relics into medieval candy. Nobles adored them, monks hoarded them, children treasured them like rare kitchen loot. The downside? Chewing them was a workout for your jaw. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue molars together. Raisins stubbornly lodged between teeth for hours. Quiet snacking? Impossible. Yet dried fruit found its moments. Mixed into pies, stirred into porridge, or chopped and tossed into honey cakes to feign variety. The wealthy wrapped them in pastry, drizzled rosewater, or soaked them in wine, a gesture to impress visiting Florentines. For common folk, holding dried fruit was a rare delight, a holiday treat, a wedding gift, or the once-a-year reminder someone remembered they existed. When that happened, you'd eat it slowly, respectfully, possibly while hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit didn't spoil quickly and was often kept in little cloth sacks or clay pots. It hardened over time, yes, but that just turned it into a longer-lasting snack, or possibly a projectile if you were creative at younger siblings. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and faintly dangerous. It stuck with you, sometimes literally. You wake up hungry, you want something hearty, something fried, something that might bite back. Enter the blood pudding ball, a medieval snack so dense, so bold, so unapologetically iron-rich, it makes modern sausage rolls look like timid breadsticks. Born out of the noble tradition of using every part of the animal, these savory spheres were proof that waste not, want not, even if what you're not wasting is blood. Let's unpack it. First, you collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though honestly, any blood would do in a pinch. You then mix it with oats, onions, suet, that's beef fat, and spices. Once that morbid porridge reaches just the right level of grim stickiness, you shape it into balls and fry them in sizzling fat until the outside crisps up like it has something to prove. The result? Dark, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor, which is code for you'll taste iron and mystery for the rest of the day. They were best served hot, fresh from the skillet, though sometimes they were eaten cold if your appetite outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Nobles might dress them up with pepper or serve them with eggs and ale. Peasants? They were just happy not to be chewing on boiled cabbage again. Blood pudding balls weren't elegant, but they were practical. Easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. If you ate 2, you could skip lunch. If you ate 4, you were probably a blacksmith, or trying to win a dare. These snacks were everywhere. At fairs, bustling markets, and roadside stalls where the air was thick with the mingled scents of livestock and raw ambition. Especially when the cold months bit hard, what could warm the soul better than fried coagulation? Blood pudding balls weren't for everyone. Some winced at their texture, others shuddered at the very idea. But in a world where survival always came first and flavor hovered somewhere near the 12th spot, these meaty morsels carved out a rightful place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. And forget everything you think you know about pancakes. These were no fluffy stacks draped in maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and fried in enough lard to make your arteries plead for early retirement. Yet, they got the job done. In a time when the other breakfast choice was a thin sorry soup mourning its own existence, these pancakes were a small, greasy luxury. Made from a modest blend of flour, eggs, and water, or sometimes ale, they were poured onto iron griddles slick with bubbling pig fat. No nonstick pans, no measuring cups, just a ladle and a prayer. The result was a flat, imperfect circle with crispy, browned edges and a chewy center. The kind of pancake tough enough to survive a bumpy horseback ride and still be mostly edible upon arrival. Sometimes burnt, sometimes undercooked, sometimes both, in a strangely endearing way. Flavors hinged on what was on hand. A splash of ale lent a tangy spark. A spoonful of honey, pure indulgence. Herbs or onions sprinkled in, a daring twist. But most often, just pancake and grease, served hot and devoured like you were fleeing a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. They didn't care about status or station. Peasants, nobles, monks, merchants, everyone ate them. Some layered them thick with cheese, others dunked them in warm broth, and some simply rolled them up and called it a day, as if the simplicity itself was a quiet rebellion. You could have them sweet or savory, or even burnt beyond recognition, a crunchy char that whispered stories of hurried kitchens and imperfect hands. Leftovers? Stack them like a makeshift cake or a shield of edible armor, because in a world that demanded survival, pancakes doubled as comfort and defense. Especially during Lent and other fasting days when meat was forbidden, pancakes became loopholes in the rules, fried, filling, and strangely indulgent despite their humble roots. They mask the austerity of the season, softening the hunger with golden warmth and hidden richness. And oh, how they concealed secrets. Pockets of unexpected flavor, sneaky ingredients that had no right to be there but made all the difference. Medieval pancakes weren't about beauty or delicacy. They were about endurance, sustenance, and a little spark of joy in the daily grind. They didn't ask for praise. All they needed was a hot pan and a willing stomach. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament lived the medieval wafer. A wafer-thin, crisp whisper of flour and water, a fragile, almost sacred bite that teetered between dessert and dental challenge. Wafers were everywhere, passed outside churches, handed out at village fairs, clutched by monks, and sometimes bobbing in soup like flat, holy croutons. Not the chocolate-dipped, cream-filled treats of modern dreams, these wafers were simple. Flour, water, eggs, and just a hint of honey or rose water if you're feeling extravagant. A thin batter was poured onto blistering hot iron plates, pressed between two scorching slabs like an ancient panini press. The outcome? Something that looked destined for communion, yet tasted like ambitious crispy paper. Humble, yet proud. Their popularity wasn't about flavor alone, but about accessibility. Wafers were portable, fast, and perfect for vendors to sell by the stack for a tidy profit. Outside churches on feast days, vendors waved warm stacks of wafers like sacred relics, calling to the faithful with silent promises, a simple pleasure in a world weighted with sin and obligation. Buy now, sin later wasn't printed anywhere, but that was the vibe, wrapped in flour and fire. If the medieval world had a delicate dance of flavor and form, wafers were its graceful, fragile performers. Often shaped with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the faint imprint of a saint's face, depending on the iron mold and the baker's fatigue, they carried more than taste. They carried stories stamped in thin, crispy layers. These designs didn't improve the flavor, but they gave you something to focus on while chewing thoughtfully, pretending you weren't a little disappointed by their fragile simplicity. Wafers were structurally delicate, shattering at the slightest wrong move, cracking like brittle whispers. Storing them was a gamble. Transporting them, a near impossible feat. Eating them outside became a high-stakes ritual, a battle against crumbs, wind, and inevitable regret. Yet, they were beloved. Light, crisp, and faintly celebratory, like a whisper of luxury in a world that often offered little. Wafers were the medieval way to treat yourself without wrecking your digestion or your wallet. Nobles enjoyed them stacked with fruit or layered with soft cheese, while for the common folk, they were sold by the dozen at street stalls and devoured immediately before turning to edible confetti. Then there was sucket. Just the name feels sticky and sweet. This medieval delicacy was fruit boiled into submission, drenched in syrup, and sealed tight like a sugary hostage. Candied oranges, dates, ginger, all coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper you shouldn't be eating this. But you did, because it was delicious, exotic, and rare. Something to savor when other treats were scarce or non-existent. Sucket wasn't for the everyday peasant gnawing on his seventh onion of the week. No, this was elite indulgence, served in noble halls, gifted as a polite but calculated gesture. I like you, but not enough to give you land. Sugar was precious, fruits were seasonal, and sucket was reserved for special moments, weddings, royal visits, or just an outrageously rich person's whim on a Wednesday. Making sucket was no small feat. Its preparation was ambitious, a labor of love and status. First, you'd boil the fruit in syrup, maybe honey, maybe refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you a favor. Then you'd drain it, let it dry a bit, and repeat several times because once wasn't enough. You weren't just preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture itself. Eventually, the result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy, chewy, intense, and so sweet it could probably be weaponized in large enough doses. Some versions were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in extra sugar, and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. But make no mistake, sucket came with status. It said you had access to sugar, trade routes, and at least one servant dedicated solely to stirring things that didn't want to be stirred. Sucket trays were passed around after banquets like edible gold coins. Guests took one piece, smiled graciously, and immediately regretted not grabbing 3. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen and maybe licked a spoon if no one was looking. So was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Sucket was one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like dessert. It was rich, refined, and just extravagant enough to make up for the fact that dinner had included boiled something. Fried eel, the grand finale of medieval junk food. A dish so strangely beloved, it made its way from peasant hearths to royal banquets without once stopping to ask, wait, am I really the best option here? Yes, it was. Eel was everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams practically writhed with them, and they were easy to catch, cheap to cook, and when fried, surprisingly crispy. Slippery when raw, bonier than expected, and shaped like the villain in a fish-themed horror story, eel was still eaten by the bucket load. Why? Because it was tasty, and more importantly, it wasn't turnips. To prepare it, you'd first have to catch the eel, usually at night when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the unpleasant task of skinning them, which was less like prepping a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that didn't want to die. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned, if you were feeling bold, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product, a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor. Like if calamari and chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was served at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, and, believe it or not, during religious fasts. That's right. Eel wasn't technically meat, so it slipped through the dietary loopholes like itself. Monks ate it, nobles flaunted it, kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquets like the sea serpent it always wanted to be. Sure, it had bones, lots of them, and yes, it occasionally wriggled long after death. But if you could get past that, and the haunting feeling that you were eating a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy skin, tender inside, and just greasy enough to make you feel like you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today, it might seem bizarre. Back then, it was a delicacy, a slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus weird. In the ancient world, Mesopotamia stood at the crossroads of mystery and mythology. Nowhere was this more evident than in how they viewed dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't just a private, meaningless experience. It was a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent directly from the gods to the subconscious. And ignoring it? That was like leaving a message from Enlil unread. Dangerous. By around 2500 BCE, Mesopotamians had developed a full-blown system of dream interpretation, recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These weren't bedtime novelties. They were used in statecraft, medicine, and religious rituals. Kings would delay wars if a troubling dream suggested bad omens. Farmers wouldn't plant crops if they saw a goat fly across the sky in their sleep. The world, they believed, was constantly speaking. It was your job to listen with your eyes closed. Professional dream interpreters called Baru priests were the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, minus the couch. They were trained in vast libraries of omen texts, such as the Ishkar Zak, an elaborate dream manual that meticulously categorized dreams, and their meanings, sometimes absurd yet eerily precise. Dreaming of eating dates? A good omen. Dreaming of your teeth falling out? Brace yourself for death in the family. Dreaming of sex with a goddess? Well, congrats, you're either divinely favored or cursed with arrogance. These dream books didn't just guess meanings. They presented cause and effect, as if dreams were simple equations. A equals B. See a snake? Expect betrayal. Fall from a rooftop? A lawsuit is coming. The world of dreams was logical, just operating on divine logic, which was far stranger than human reason. But the Mesopotamians didn't stop at interpretation. They practiced dream incubation too. If a ruler sought guidance from the gods, he might sleep in a temple under strict conditions, fasting, cleansing rituals, perhaps a few incense offerings, and wait for a revelatory dream. The idea was that certain environments made the divine connection stronger, clearer, and less prone to nightmares about drunk goats. For Mesopotamians, the dream world was not a mystery to solve. It was a realm to navigate with caution, reverence, and a very large clay tablet library. They believed the gods were always speaking. You just had to be asleep to hear them. In ancient Egypt, dreams weren't merely nightly occurrences. They were considered sacred texts in motion. The Egyptians believed dreams were not mere whispers of the night, but sacred messages, echoes from the gods, the ancestors, or even from one's own Ka, the spiritual double that shadows every person. Each dream, whether gentle or terrifying, carried weight and intent. It was a language of the divine, meant to warn, bless, instruct, or unsettle the dreamer's soul. By the time the New Kingdom flourished around 1550 to 1070 BCE, this profound reverence had blossomed into written form. Egyptians began inscribing their dream interpretations onto papyrus, creating some of the earliest manuals in human history, maps for navigating the unseen. Among these ancient guides, the Ramesside Dream Book stands out. Found in the quiet village of Deir el-Medina, it is no light bedtime reading. It is a sacred diagnostic, a ledger of dreams and their meanings, etched carefully with hundreds of scenarios. Each interpretation weighs the balance between favor and disaster, promising either blessing or doom. But the logic was mysterious, often defying ordinary understanding. For instance, a man dreaming of eating crocodile flesh might raise eyebrows today, but in that world, this was no nightmare. The crocodile was sacred to Sobek, the god of strength and power. To consume crocodile in dreams was to absorb the god's divine force, a symbol of ascension and honor. Every entry began with the solemn phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by vivid, symbolic visions. These were not random guesses, but the distilled wisdom of centuries, ritual knowledge passed from temple to temple, the personal revelations of priests, and the collective memory of a civilization. The interpretations came sharply divided, inked in red and black, good or bad, blessing or curse. To receive a bad omen was to know that incense must be burned, prayers whispered, and a priest's intercession sought to shield the soul from impending misfortune. In the world of the Egyptians, dreams were a sacred dialogue, a bridge between the mortal and the divine, a space where fate whispered its secrets in shadowed symbols. Priests in temple complexes, especially those serving healing deities like Serket or Thoth, sometimes offered services in dream incubation, where supplicants would sleep in the temple and await guidance or healing through visions. The idea was to open a divine channel through purification, prayer, and controlled sleep. This wasn't mere superstition. It was healthcare, divination, and theology rolled into one night's rest. Dreams also influenced magic, and medicine amulets might be prescribed to fend off recurring nightmares. Specific rituals could be performed to erase a dream, much like you'd erase a curse. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was not idle. It was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could appear and offer glimpses into hidden truths, if you had the wisdom and a priest to decode them. In the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than divine whispers. They were clinical appointments with the gods. Central to this belief was the practice of incubation, a ritual where individuals would sleep inside a temple in hopes of receiving a healing vision. And no deity was more closely tied to this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples known as Asclepieia, which dotted the Greek world from Epidaurus to Pergamon, the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate came seeking cures. But instead of pills or potions, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and performed under specific spiritual conditions. Before entering the temple's sleeping quarters or abaton, a person would undergo purification, bathing, fasting, and sometimes sacrificing an animal. Only after these rituals could they lie down on a stone bed and wait for the god to appear in a dream. The results? According to inscriptions and ancient testimonies, some patients dreamed of Asclepius touching them with his staff, or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. They would awaken healed, or at least believe they had received divine instructions on what to do next. Whether these dreams were real, psychosomatic, or placebo-driven, the effects were profound. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, acknowledged the value of dreams in diagnosis. They didn't dismiss them as nonsense. In fact, they believed the body could reveal its state through symbolic visions. A dream of flowing water might suggest kidney issues. A dream of being crushed could point to a chest ailment. In Hippocratic texts, dreams were often classified as either natural or divine. Natural dreams were caused by diet, digestion, or emotional stress. Divine ones, a whole other category, were direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. But not all dream interpreters wore white robes and carried scrolls. The oneirocreti, or dream readers, were the real stars of the public square, using dream manuals and omens. And an enormous supply of interpretive flair, they translated dreams into warnings, blessings, or instructions. The most famous of these guides was the Oneirokritiki, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a book still studied centuries later. In Greece, the dream wasn't just a nighttime experience. It was a bridge between mortal and divine, body and soul, illness and healing. And if you were lucky, you'd wake up with a cure, and maybe a snake curled at your feet. Throughout the ancient world, one category of dream carried more weight than all others: the prophetic dream. These weren't just messages, they were warnings, revelations, or calls to action. For cultures spanning Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were sacred transmissions from a higher plane, direct links to gods, fate, or the mysterious mechanisms of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a recognized and respected channel of divine communication. The Old Testament is filled with examples. Think of Joseph, son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing before his own, a symbol of his future rise to power. Later, as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he predicted 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. That one dream, of cows, fat and thin, altered the course of Egypt's economy. Joseph didn't just read dreams, he became a national strategist by doing so. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, kings often received dreams that foretold victory, disaster, or divine favor. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed he saw the gods in his dreams, guiding him to success in war and governance. Prophetic dreams were seen as confirmation that a ruler had divine legitimacy, essential in a world where the line between king and deity was thin. The Greeks, too, recognized this prophetic potential. Dreams were categorized. Those from the subconscious were called enhypnia, but those that revealed truth were called oniroi, alethinoi. These were not taken lightly. Before major decisions, founding a city, declaring war, launching a voyage, Greek leaders often consulted dreams or those trained to interpret them. Dreams were so revered that they had their own minor deities, the oneiroi, winged spirits who entered the sleeper's mind with messages from the gods. Even the Romans, typically more pragmatic, took prophetic dreams seriously. The Emperor Augustus was said to have dreamt of future glory, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his reign. Perhaps not enough, considering how that turned out. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, before defeating Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of victory sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams weren't side notes. They were tools of power, instruments of policy, and evidence of divine selection. The fate of nations, the health of empires, and the rise of legends often began with something as simple as a whispered vision in the dark. While Greek Asclepian temples are the most renowned, the art of ancient dream incubation was far from exclusive to Greece. In Anatolia, present-day Turkey, dream healing blossomed through a rich tapestry woven from Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions. Here, temples and sacred sites stood as portals, inviting divine forces to touch the sleeping minds of the faithful. Perhaps the most captivating example emerges from the cult of Men, the Phrygian lunar god of healing, cycles, and, naturally, dreams. His temples crowned hills that gazed upward, seemingly poised to catch the moon's silent whispers, beaming down into the dreams of those who sought his favor. People burdened by bodily suffering, spiritual unrest, or uncertain futures journeyed to these shrines to engage in incubation, a ritualized sleep aimed at drawing healing or guidance from the divine realm. Though echoing the Asclepian methods, Anatolian incubation danced to its own rhythm. Worshippers might traverse labyrinthine paths or sleep beneath celestial carvings, believing that sacred geometry would sharpen the focus of divine messages. Music, incense, and chant wove a sonic cocoon, tuning the sleeper's consciousness to celestial frequencies. This was not ordinary rest. It was sleep as a sacred reception, a spiritual communion. Ancient texts reveal the presence of dream priests, gifted interpreters and guides who shepherded these nocturnal encounters. Some even seeded dreams, planting symbols or imagery before sleep to shape the visions that would come. Imagine a supplicant longing for a glimpse of their future child, slipping a carved fertility idol beneath their pillow. A dream of a lion might herald a courageous son. Rain might foretell a daughter blessed with growth and wisdom, the priest's word turning vision into prophecy. Hittite records further attest to divine visitations in dreams, especially among royalty. Kings and queens received sacred counsel, healing insights, and sometimes stern warnings from the gods in the quiet sanctuary of sleep. One such dream famously instructed a queen to welcome a foreign goddess into her shrine, an early, poignant example of divine diplomacy shaping human affairs. Dream incubation in Anatolia wasn't merely a private affair, it was a sacred communal act, woven into the cosmic fabric itself. Pilgrims journeyed from far and wide, drawn by the hope of healing and renewal, forming temporary communities bound not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and faith. To dream was not a passive drift into the night. It was a deliberate ritual, a language spoken in silence where healing and prophecy flowed not from reason, but from the mysterious currents of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, this ancient art of interpreting dreams had blossomed into a disciplined craft, and one man, Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek from Asia Minor, became its greatest architect. He authored the Oneirocritica, the most comprehensive and enduring dream manual of the ancient world. Unlike the mystical scribes who cloaked dreams in divine enigma, Artemidorus brought a scholar's rigor and a streetwise psychologist's curiosity to the task. The Oneirocritica was no mere pamphlet of mysteries. It was a sprawling 5-book compendium, penned in clear Greek, filled with thousands of dream scenarios and their meanings, drawn from personal interviews, temple archives, and public performances. Artemidorus claimed decades of collecting dream stories from every walk of life. Sailors battered by storms, merchants navigating trade routes, prostitutes living in shadows, soldiers hardened by battle. His logic was simple yet profound. To grasp the soul of a culture, listen to its dreams. He categorized dreams with care: actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, and the tangled threads of relationships. Dreaming of flight, it might mean freedom soaring or arrogance unchecked. Dreaming of nakedness in public, depending on your place in society, it could signal shame or an impending rise to power. Dreaming of teeth falling out, a sign of loss, often of loved ones, a meaning that has echoed through centuries. But Artemidorus' genius lay in his insistence on context. Unlike earlier dream interpreters who handed out fixed meanings, he understood that a dream's significance shifted with the dreamer's status, gender, occupation, and the twists of their current life story. In this, he made dreams not just symbols, but living conversations, intimate, complex, and deeply human. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck might brace for looming business troubles, while a poor man dreaming the same might glimpse the promise of new fortune. Dream interpretation was never one-size-fits-all. It was carefully tailored, an ancient form of psychotherapy, sensitive to circumstance and spirit. Artemidorus confronted symbolism head-on, recognizing that dreams spoke in metaphor and irony. To dream of death did not herald demise, it could signal renewal. A dream of sex might not reveal desire, but instead hint at struggles for power, dominance, or guilt. His interpretations walked a strange tightrope, blending logic with the surreal. The Oneirocritica wasn't mere curiosity, it shaped centuries of dream interpretation across the Roman Empire and Byzantine world. Translated into Arabic, it carried its flame far beyond the fall of classical temples. With Artemidorus, dreams transformed into texts, complex scripts to be studied and decoded, revealing not just prophecy but profound insight. Though he may have doubted that dreams were divine messages, he certainly believed they arose from something deep, strange, and worthy of exploration. Not all ancient dreams were gentle gifts from gods. Some were dark terrors, haunting visions thought to spring from restless spirits, demons, or the shadowed underworld. These nightmares weren't dismissed as bad sleep. They were warnings, punishments, portents of things yet to come. The Babylonians pioneered the distinction between divine dreams and those polluted by malevolent forces. Dreams causing fear, illness, or distress were seen as cursed. Priests would then perform apotropaic rituals, cleansing spells, offering symbolic acts meant to neutralize the dream's power. For instance, if chased by a demon in sleep, one might be advised to rest with a protective amulet beneath the pillow or burn cedarwood incense to repel evil. The Egyptians, too, developed sophisticated practices against nightmares, believing certain dreams were sent by malicious entities, even the dead themselves. Amulets bearing the Eye of Horus, or images of Bes, the dwarf god who protected households from dark forces, were worn to guard against these attacks. Some people even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that had to be spoken out of existence before it could manifest in the physical world. In Greek thought, nightmares often signified a message, not from the Olympians, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the terrifying Erinyes, Furies, could appear in dreams to express divine displeasure or signal a crime left unpunished. Dreamers who ignored these warnings did so at their peril. The philosopher Plato, in The Republic, even described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower parts of the soul ran wild. For him, the nightmare was not just a spiritual warning, but a psychological one, an indication that your inner self was out of balance. Even the Romans, practical as ever, feared dreams of certain animals like owls, snakes, or wolves as signs of impending death, betrayal, or war. They believed the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn, sometimes to accuse. In every culture, nightmares were more than bad dreams. They were seen as cosmic red flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were always connected, and even in sleep, there was no true escape from fate. In the ancient world, dreams weren't just spiritual, they were political assets. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets often weaponized dreams to justify decisions, sway public opinion, or consolidate authority. When the gods spoke in sleep, those in power were quick to say, "They spoke to me." Take Alexander the Great, for instance. Before he conquered Egypt, he reportedly dreamed of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. Upon arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, declaring Alexander a divine offspring. Was the dream real? Was it staged? It didn't matter. The message solidified his rule and painted him as more than mortal, a living god in the eyes of his troops and subjects. Dreams were especially useful during political transitions or uncertain times. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamed of a great victory at Actium, which he won against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Afterward, this dream was immortalized in literature and coins, turning it into a sacred narrative. Later emperors followed suit. If the gods supported your dream, who dared oppose your actions? Priests and oracles often played into this. Dream interpretation became a theological tool, especially when it aligned with the interests of a ruler or temple elite. Suppose a rebellious governor dreamt of disaster. The priest might interpret it as divine punishment for challenging imperial authority. On the flip side, dreams of fruitfulness and victory, interpreted correctly, could embolden leaders to begin campaigns, raise taxes, or enact reforms. This wasn't limited to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt claimed in temple inscriptions that her birth was foretold in a dream by the god Ammon, who appeared to her mother and prophesied divine rulership. By framing her reign as destined in dreams, she strengthened her legitimacy on a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used dreams to challenge kings. Daniel, for instance, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue, forecasting the rise and fall of empires. It wasn't just dream reading, it was geopolitics wrapped in allegory. In every civilization, dreams allowed leaders to say, "This is not just my will, it is the will of heaven." Whether divine revelation or calculated propaganda, dreams were a powerful currency, turning the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time. Though the ancient temples have crumbled, and the priests of dream now sleep beneath layers of dust, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation lives on, whispering through time, science, and psychology. Much of what we believe today about dreams, our fascination with symbolism, recurring motifs, even nightmares, has roots in ancient frameworks that tried to make sense of the sleeping mind. The medieval world inherited these traditions wholesale. Islamic scholars translated the Oneirocritica of Artemidorus into Arabic, refining and expanding upon it. In Islamic mysticism, dreams became deeply respected as means of divine guidance. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians began cataloging the dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that often predicted future miracles or divine justice. The same structure remained: sleep as a portal to the sacred, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as the bridge between human and divine. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we meet Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, borrowed heavily from the symbolic structure pioneered millennia before. In The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed desires and fears, but he still used ancient tools: metaphor, symbol, narrative. His protege, Carl Jung, went further, describing the dream world as populated by archetypes, universal figures like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man, eerily similar to figures one might find in a Greek temple or Babylonian omen list. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mysticism, still respects their complexity: REM, sleep, lucid dreaming, and the influence of trauma or memory on dream content. These ideas echo ancient notions that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul. Pop culture, too, carries on the torch. From film and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality, dreams remain a source of fascination. Whether it's a horror film based on sleep paralysis or a dream journal app promising self-discovery, the ancient idea still pulses beneath, that what we see in sleep matters. In the end, the ancients may not have had brain scans or sleep labs, but they understood something we still chase today. Dreams are not random. They are stories, signals, or shadows, whispered in the language of gods, ancestors, or ourselves. The question remains the same across time. What is your dream trying to tell you? In the mid-19th century, the United States was a country stretched thin, pulled taut at the seams. By 1860, California had been a state for 10 years, yet it often felt more like a distant cousin than a true sibling. The bustling East thrummed with cities, telegraphs, and railroads, while the western frontier lay rugged, remote, and painfully disconnected. A letter sent from New York to San Francisco might take 3 or 4 weeks, or longer if storms, delays, or bandits interfered. And that was only if the letter arrived at all. Mail routes then were labyrinthine and inefficient. The most common path was a perilous journey. Ships carried mail down the Atlantic coast, across the Isthmus of Panama, then back up the Pacific. A voyage fraught with delays, tropical diseases, and logistical nightmares. Overland, the stagecoach route was slow, perilous, and frequently stuck in mud, snowbound mountain passes, or threatened by outlaws and hostile terrain. This lag wasn't just a frustration, it was a political problem. The federal government feared that California, increasingly isolated, might drift away in spirit or loyalty. In a time when secession was looming, keeping the country united was not merely a hope, it was an urgent necessity. Entrepreneurs and visionaries floated bold, even reckless ideas. None bolder than one relying on the one resource the West had in abundance: open land and fast horses. What if skilled riders could gallop across the continent in shifts, swapping horses every 10 to 15 miles? Could they cut delivery time from weeks to just 10 days? The proposal seemed insane. The route would stretch nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, crossing mountains, deserts, rivers, and largely unmapped territories. Riders would face blistering heat, freezing nights, and the ever-present threat of ambush. Yet if it worked, it would become the fastest communication line between East and West. The problem was clear: America was growing faster than its infrastructure could keep up. And so, driven by desperation, ambition, and pure frontier daring, a solution galloped into history, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was born. But it did not simply emerge from dust and dream. It was the bold vision of three businessmen from the freight and stagecoach firm Russell, Majors, and Waddell. Based in Missouri, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were veterans of the overland shipping world. Their company already hauled freight and government supplies across the wild frontier, and now they dared to take on the impossible, stitching a continent together on horseback. But in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical goal: speeding up mail delivery to California in the shortest time possible. At the time, Russell in particular was feeling the pressure. His reputation was on the line due to financial scandals and failed ventures. He saw the Pony Express not just as a patriotic service, but as a personal redemption arc, a way to restore his name and gain favor with the government. If they could prove their relay system worked, they hoped to land a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander Majors brought the logistics brain. A meticulous planner, he demanded discipline from his employees, even requiring riders and station masters to swear oaths against drinking and cursing. He also developed a highly structured system for the express. Stations would be built every 10 to 15 miles, larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles, and the entire route would be maintained like a military operation. William B. Waddell, the quietest of the trio, provided the legal and financial backbone. While Russell was the salesman and Major the operational genius, Waddell kept the books and ensured the company stayed afloat, at least for a while. Together, the three poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture. They bought over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and built roughly 190 stations across the most remote parts of the frontier. They knew it was a gamble, and they knew the route would be grueling. But they also knew that whoever solved the communication crisis would earn a permanent place in American history. And so, without any government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was a bold move, financially reckless, logistically insane, and yet deeply symbolic of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was ready to ride. The race against time and terrain was on. Creating the Pony Express route was like building a fragile bridge across a continent with no safety net and almost no margin for error. The full distance spanned nearly 2,000 miles, stretching from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, through a dizzying array of landscapes: rolling plains, mountain ranges, high deserts, and dangerous river crossings. To make this insane idea work, the founders built a chain of approximately 190 relay stations, spaced every 10 to 15 miles, about the distance a horse could ride at full speed before tiring. Every 75 to 100 miles, a home station provided rest and shelter for the riders where they could sleep, eat, and hand off the mail to a fresh rider. But the real backbone of the express was the horses, more than 400 in all. They were chosen not for looks or stature, but for sheer speed and stamina. In the east, fleet-footed thoroughbreds ruled the prairie. In the rugged west, compact and hardy Mustangs carried the mail across the mountains and desert. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, jump off mid-stride, and leap onto a fresh mount in a matter of seconds. Each station had to be manned, stocked, and secure. Some were little more than sod huts or wooden shacks. Others were fortified structures surrounded by barbed fencing and guarded by station keepers with rifles. Supplies, water, feed, and food had to be transported in advance. This meant months of preparation, and it all had to be done in some of the most remote, inhospitable land in America. Weather posed one of the biggest threats. Riders would endure snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in the Utah desert, and brutal summer heat on the Nebraska plains. Wild animals, swollen rivers, and collapsing trails were daily hazards. And then there were human dangers: bandits, outlaws, and the rising tensions of conflict with Native American tribes. But despite the chaos, the system worked. With riders swapping every 75 to 100 miles and fresh horses every 10 to 15, the mail flew across the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed at the time. It was a logistical miracle, stitched together by courage, sweat, and raw determination. In a land where miles meant isolation, the Pony Express created a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3rd, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut in St. Joseph, Missouri. A crowd gathered at the Pikes Peak Stables building, buzzing with excitement. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, took the leather mochila, a specially designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck speed. The crowd cheered. Cannons fired. And just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed around 20 pounds, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams bound for California. A telegraph message had already been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now travel the rest of the way on horseback, symbolizing the union of technology and raw human effort. At the same moment, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the bidirectional relay. Between them stood nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 stations in some of the harshest terrain North America had to offer, and they planned to cross it in just 10 days. Each rider on the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a lathered horse and onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches and could be quickly slipped over the saddle horn without unstrapping anything. Speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night, through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the chaos, the first ride succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours, a triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a handful of letters rode in that first mochila, its symbolic weight was monumental. This was never just about moving mail from point A to B. It was about possibility, a bold declaration that this wild, fractured continent could be stitched together. That man and horse could outrun isolation. For the riders, it marked the dawn of a perilous, exhilarating journey. For the nation, it was a taste of something revolutionary. Instant communication, swifter than anyone dared imagine. The vast West suddenly felt a little smaller. But the true lifeblood of the Pony Express wasn't horses, stations, or even the mochila itself. It was the riders, a fearless band of young, lean daredevils who braved savage weather, untamed wilderness, and the threat of war to deliver the mail. They weren't mere couriers, they were legends in the making. Most riders were barely out of childhood, no older than 18, often closer to 16. Lightweight, usually under 125 pounds so as not to burden their steeds. Speed and endurance were their lifelines. The famed recruitment ads allegedly proclaimed, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred." Though the exact wording may be folklore, the spirit behind it was brutally real. These boys raced 75 to 100 miles per shift, swapping horses at every station, yet never pausing until the mochila passed safely to the next rider. They rode through the dead of night, through torrents of rain, biting snowstorms, and searing heat. Armed with revolvers and rifles, their best defense against bandits and hostile attacks was their sheer speed. Many rode alone, unarmed, trusting only their swift legs and instinct to outrun danger. Some riders became legends, folk heroes carved from grit and adrenaline. Pony Bob Haslam once rode 380 miles in less than 2 days to deliver mail amid a violent Paiute uprising, even after being wounded by arrows. William Buffalo Bill Cody, later famed as a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at just 15 years old, though historians still debate whether that story is true. But truth needed no embellishment. The reality was already raw and thrilling. Riders had to navigate the towering Rocky Mountains, cross the vast, merciless Great Basin desert, and traverse lands where a single misstep could mean freezing to death, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. Yet through all this danger, the Pony Express maintained an astonishing reliability. Only one mochila, the leather mail pouch, was ever lost during its entire run. Despite the risks, many riders loved the job. Paid well for their youth, $100 to $150 a month, a small fortune for a teenager, they craved the speed, the rush, and above all, the purpose. They weren't just carrying letters, they were binding a sprawling, fractured nation together. The Pony Express riders were more than messengers. They were symbols of American courage, endurance, and unyielding tenacity. With every pounding hoofbeat, They galloped into myth and memory. For 18 unforgettable months, they proved no frontier was too vast to conquer. Riding wasn't just work, it was a daily wager with death. Most grown men would have turned back facing the gauntlet these teenagers faced: nature's fury, hostile enemies, and a land that seemed hungry to swallow them whole. The environment itself was one of the fiercest foes. Riders battled blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, scorching heat in the Nevada desert, and sudden thunderstorms that could flood river crossings or turn dirt paths into mud traps. A slip from a horse in freezing cold could mean deadly hypothermia. One wrong step in a swollen river could drown you, and many riders came terrifyingly close to that fate. Then there were the animals. Packs of wolves sometimes chased riders through the night, their howls echoing like warnings in the cold air. Rattlesnakes lay coiled in the trailside brush, silent but deadly, and mountain lions prowled the high passes, unseen but ever-present threats. Yet, even more dangerous than the wild creatures were the bandits and bushwhackers, men who knew that a rider's mochila held more than just letters. Some contained gold dust or money orders, treasures that made the riders targets. Though armed with revolvers, riders were often outnumbered, and every stop was a gamble between mission and survival. Tensions with Native American tribes simmered and occasionally exploded during the Pony Express's brief, perilous existence. The Paiute War of 1860, fueled by land disputes, broken promises, and encroachment, brought fierce attacks on Pony Express stations. Riders were ambushed in the shadows, station keepers were killed, and several stations burned to ashes. The most legendary story is that of Pony Bob Haslam, who galloped nearly 190 miles through hostile territory, wounded by arrows, yet pressed on to deliver the mail, a testament to determination etched in blood and dust. Isolation itself was a threat. Riders rode alone for hours, accompanied only by their horses, their weapons, and the encroaching darkness. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the wilderness, never to be found. And yet they rode. Despite the dangers, the system endured. Mail was delayed but rarely lost. Riders were wounded but almost always survived. In 18 months, only a handful of men lost their lives doing this dangerous work. The Pony Express was no romantic myth of the Wild West. It was a brutal, terrifying reality. But in surviving the wilderness and human threats alike, these riders became legends, proving that even the harshest terrain could be conquered, if only long enough to deliver the mail. Though it lasted just 18 months, the Pony Express's impact was swift, profound, and far-reaching. In a nation on the brink of civil war, desperate for unity across sprawling lands, the Express declared one undeniable truth: distance was no longer destiny. Before the Pony Express, letters took weeks to travel from the East Coast to California. Vital political decisions, business deals, and personal news often arrived too late to matter. But with the Express, mail could reach San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians were no longer out of sync with the rest of the country. Businesses grew bolder. Newspapers could report near real-time updates from across the nation. Families felt closer. And most importantly, the Union felt more connected, which would become critical as the Civil War loomed. Politically, the Express also reassured the federal government that the West was within reach. It symbolized national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation felt dangerously close. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California during the tense months leading up to Lincoln's election, in part thanks to the Express. Economically, it helped lay the groundwork for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations built across remote territory became future sites for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. Many Pony Express routes would later be absorbed into more permanent communication systems. What was once a bold gamble became the blueprint for how America would connect itself coast to coast. And culturally, the Pony Express became the embodiment of frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders, creating instant heroes. Young men across the country dreamed of taking the reins, galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of destiny. The Express became mythologized even as it operated, capturing the imagination of a country hungry for symbols of courage and unity. Even after it ended, the Pony Express continued to shape American identity. It represented speed, courage, sacrifice, and above all, possibility. In just over a year, it managed to do what steamships, Congress, and diplomacy had failed to do: make a fractured, sprawling nation feel like one. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail, it delivered the future one gallop at a time. For all its daring and triumph, the Pony Express was doomed from the start. It wasn't a matter of failure, it was a matter of technology. As fast as a horse could ride, nothing could compete with the speed of a wire. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially launched in April 1860, construction began on the transcontinental telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication system that would transmit messages in minutes rather than days. The telegraph poles and lines advanced steadily, westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Every mile of wire spelled another nail in the coffin of the Express. By October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the first ride, the final telegraph wire was strung across the country. The system went live and the connection was instantaneous. That very same day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The silence of hoofbeats was replaced by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph, the Pony Express was bleeding money. Despite its legendary performance, it was a commercial disaster. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had poured more than $700,000 into the operation and barely recouped a fraction. With no federal subsidy and high operational costs, horses, riders, station upkeep, and supply logistics, the Express was never a sustainable business model. It was built as a proof of concept, a bold advertisement for a mail contract that never fully came through. Russell himself faced financial scandal, and the company began to collapse. By the time the telegraph was completed, the Express was already on its last legs. Heroic, beloved, but completely obsolete. Yet the end came with little bitterness. The very goal the Pony Express set out to prove, that rapid coast-to-coast communication was possible, had been achieved. Riders turned to other frontier jobs, stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation turned its eyes to the future. The fall of the Pony Express was not a failure, it was a passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would later yield to radio, satellites, and the internet. But for one brief, shining moment, America watched in awe as teenage boys and powerful horses conquered time and distance. In a world obsessed with speed, the Pony Express galloped into legend and left hoofprints no telegraph wire could ever erase. Though it lasted only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the nation's history. In reality, it was a risky, short-lived business venture. But in the public imagination, it became something far greater, a symbol of heroism, speed, and the relentless frontier spirit. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks transformed the Express into legend, the image of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a six-shooter at his side, captured the nation's heart. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still defining itself, the Pony Express offered a story of bravery, sacrifice, and unity through hardship. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, whether he truly rode for the Express or not, capitalized on the legend in his Wild West shows, cementing the image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions across the world. The Express became shorthand for grit, daring, and everything Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now stand in cities across the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths trace the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historical tours keep the memory alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps honoring this brief but bold endeavor that helped unite a sprawling nation. But the story endures for a deeper reason. The Pony Express reminds us of a time when human endurance raced side by side with nature's obstacles, when sending a message meant risking everything and connection demanded raw courage. It tells us that speed once came not from satellites or cables, but from sheer willpower and the fearless spirit of riders charging through snow, desert, and darkness, armed only with a horse and a dream. In our age of instant communication and global networks, it's easy to forget just how hard it once was to connect. The Pony Express stands as a testament to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics or electricity, but with muscle, grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend lives on, not because it endured, but because, for a fleeting moment, it outran the impossible. The earliest known beer didn't come in frosty mugs or branded bottles. It emerged from a humble clay pot nestled in the heart of a Sumerian village. Thousands of years ago, long before Rome rose or pyramids pierced the sky, the ancient people of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways both simple and sacred. And they weren't merely drinking it, they were worshiping it. Beer in Sumerian society wasn't just a casual drink. It was sustenance, currency, religious offering, and a symbol of civilization itself. It's no coincidence that the oldest written recipe in human history isn't for bread or soup, but for beer. Etched on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE, the Hymn to Ninkasi both praises the goddess of beer and weaves brewing instructions into sacred verse. Ninkasi was no minor figure. She was revered. To brew beer was to call forth her divine presence. The brewing was a ritual as much as a process. The Sumerians baked a special bread called bapir, made from barley and sometimes sweetened with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and left to ferment naturally, turning grain into a drink that carried the spirit of gods and people alike. The result wasn't anything like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more like a nutritious gruel, and it was essential to daily life. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated, but beer, thanks to its fermentation process, was safer. It was rich in calories and nutrients, and it became a vital part of the diet for laborers, priests, and royalty alike. Workers on temple projects or irrigation ditches were frequently paid in beer rations, which could amount to several liters a day. Socially, beer was a communal experience. Rather than drinking from mugs, people often gathered around large ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, filtering out the sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about bonding, surviving, and even honoring the gods. In many ways, beer helped define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in rituals, law codes, agriculture, and economics. It was liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act. And it set the stage for brewing cultures across the ancient world, from the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual beginning, the Egyptians industrialized it. By the time the Old Kingdom was rising along the Nile, beer had become more than a sacred drink. It was a pillar of Egyptian society, woven into everything from daily meals to divine offerings and funeral rites. Egyptian beer was brewed on a scale that dwarfed earlier methods. At large temples and palace complexes, massive breweries operated as part of the state economy. In fact, beer production was often overseen by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed beer was a gift from Osiris, god of agriculture and fertility, and it featured prominently in ceremonies honoring deities such as Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy, frequently associated with intoxication and revelry. The brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians, but had evolved in both technique and scale. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley was partially baked, then crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water, dates, or honey were added for sweetness, and the mixture was left to ferment in ceramic jars. The resulting beverage was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious, sometimes consumed with a spoon rather than sipped. Beer wasn't just for the living. Tombs were stocked with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside loaves of bread and meat. Beer was considered so essential that no respectable journey to the next world could be imagined without it. Recipes for the dead, lists of beer offerings to the gods, and murals showing the brewing process all highlight its spiritual importance. But beer also fueled the labor economy. Workers who built the pyramids weren't slaves, they were paid laborers, and part of their daily rations included beer, sometimes up to 4 liters a day. This wasn't an indulgence, it was hydration, nutrition, and morale all in one. One archaeologist even called it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over beer production and distribution. Taxes were levied in beer, and its quality was regulated. Women, especially priestesses and temple workers, were often involved in brewing, reinforcing its connection to both domestic life and sacred power. In short, Beer in Egypt wasn't a side note. It was central. It nourished the people, pleased the gods, and filled the tombs. And like the Nile itself, it flowed through every part of Egyptian life. Across ancient civilizations, beer wasn't just a drink. It was divine communion. Its frothy presence was invited into temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation was not seen as a chemical process, but as a mystical transformation, a gift from the gods that turned simple grain into sacred liquid. To brew beer was to interact with the spiritual world, and to drink it was to partake in something more than sustenance. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi embodied this connection. Her hymn was both a prayer and instruction, an act of devotion, and a manual for sacred brewing. Rituals likely began with chants to invoke her presence before fermenting began. It's possible that the final beer was shared as part of temple offerings given to priests. Are you satisfied with the stories and insights we've shared so far? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss any exciting content ahead. And before you go to sleep, remember to send warm goodnight wishes to your loved ones.